I can say without hesitation that Blake Lively's legal team is in a complete state of panic right now. And the reason I can say this with confidence is not only because of what I am seeing in the legal filings and the media, but also because of the chatter happening behind the scenes. There is a frantic scramble underway, and the center of that panic seems to revolve around content creators like myself and others, who have simply been reporting on the developments in her legal saga. And what's happening now is the story is starting to gain significant traction in the media. Multiple outlets are now taking a closer look and beginning to see that Blake Lively appears to be attempting to shift the narrative away from the original allegations against Jed Wallace and redirect the focus toward independent creators and journalists who have covered her actions. The central problem with this strategy is that it fundamentally collapses her own narrative, because Jed Wallace was dismissed from the case just yesterday, and that dismissal was not a small loss. It was a monumental blow to her legal position. Her team is publicly claiming that the dismissal was purely a jurisdictional matter and that they still plan to evaluate their options against Jed Wallace. But those public statements are not aligning with their behavior in court or behind the scenes. During the emergency meeting with the judge regarding her deposition, it was clear that there was real hesitation on whether they had any viable path forward against Jed Wallace. Despite all the noise, her legal team is making the underlying truth is that they do not appear to have the evidence they need to refile a complaint against him. Blake Lively filed a protective order. She insisted that everyone show up to her lawyer's office. She said she would be present for the deposition. She had attorneys fly in from California and Texas for this deposition. She incurred thousands of dollars in preparation, and yet at the last moment, she canceled the deposition altogether. This occurred right after the judge gave her a very simple option to file a dummy complaint, a placeholder complaint, just so that Jed Wallace could technically be part of the case again and participate in the deposition. The judge made it clear that she could add him back into the case temporarily and then later decide if she wanted to pursue further claims. But she still refused. This was not just a procedural issue, it was a signal that something much deeper is wrong with her case. Jed Wallace's attorney, Charles Babcock, raised concerns about the dummy complaint idea, suggesting that if it were filled with baseless or sensational allegations such as a racketeering charge, it could be completely inappropriate and undermine the process entirely. This was not just legal posturing, it was a response to a real fear that Blake might try to create a massive new conspiracy theory to keep Jed in the case, and by doing so she could continue to tie content creators like myself into the smear campaign narrative. The fact that she backed out of the deposition shortly after being given the chance to keep Jed in the case shows that she is not confident she can back up her allegations with actual evidence. In fact, she may not be able to legally sustain any claim against him now that the judge has made clear what would be required for her to do so. And yet this is just the beginning of the story. The real crisis for her team is not just that Jed is out of the case, but what that means for the rest of her claims. Because in her amended complaint, Blake clearly stated that Jed Wallace was the orchestrator of a digital smear campaign. She alleged that he was hired by Melissa Nathan and tasked with building a team to target her through online manipulation. She claimed that he managed a network of creators who were paid to post content attacking her, all while making it look like it was organic. She cited quotes and invoices that supposedly showed payment options for social manipulation, and used these to tie Jed to the broader online activity surrounding her film and personal conduct. She even referenced specific dates such as August 6th and August 7th and discussed messages between Abel Heath and other parties referencing price quotes for untraceable social media tactics, including fan engagement strategies and crisis teams. She claimed that Jed was involved in the hiring and execution of this campaign. She even accused him of mobilizing teams in Hawaii and beyond to run this operation. Yet now that he has been dismissed from the case, there is no longer a mastermind behind the so-called digital army. If he is out, then who is managing this campaign? If there is no leader, then how can there be a conspiracy? And if there is no conspiracy, how can she claim that people like myself are part of something coordinated? If there is no one coordinating it, this is the fatal flaw in her shifting legal strategy, and her team knows it. Without Jed, the entire framework she created for her lawsuit begins to unravel, and that is precisely why her legal team is scrambling and trying to figure out what to do next. They know that removing Jed from the case essentially removes the core of their argument against independent creators. They have been trying to paint us as operatives, as willing participants in a smear campaign orchestrated by a third party, but that third party is no longer legally tied to the case, which means any subpoenas or accusations made against us lack a foundation. Her refusal to sit for a deposition in these circumstances is telling, because it implies that she does not want to be questioned. by Jed Wallace's attorney, since doing so could expose the weaknesses in her case more directly. And this brings us to the larger issue that her legal team appears to be confronting, which is that their strategy may have backfired in the worst way possible. The judge made clear that any attempt to file a new complaint against Jed Wallace would have to be based on solid evidence, including direct actions that harmed her in New York, because that is the jurisdictional requirement. Yet almost all of the allegations she made in her amended complaint involved activities that occurred outside of New York. They occurred in Hawaii and California, online in general, and with no specific tie to actions in New York. That means the threshold for refiling is incredibly high, and from what we can tell from discovery, she does not have what she needs to meet that threshold. So what is she doing now? Instead of trying to fix her case based on facts, she is shifting the story again, and this time, the shift is even more alarming. Instead of focusing on Jed Wallace as the primary person responsible for what she claims was a digital smear campaign, Blake Lively is now attempting to reframe the entire situation by broadening her accusations to include everyone around him and even extending the blame to content creators directly. This is a significant change from her original claim that Jed was the one who was orchestrating the entire operation, that he was the digital army man, as she referred to him, someone hired by Melissa Nathan to mobilize creators online in a way that appeared organic but was allegedly part of a deliberate strategy to attack her. Now that the judge has dismissed Jed from the case and emphasized that there must be clear jurisdictional relevance for him to be brought back into the fold, Blake is forced to adjust her claims, and what she has chosen to do instead is cast a much wider net, accusing content creators and other individuals and platforms of being the real perpetrators of the smear campaign. She is now suggesting that the entire campaign was not necessarily managed by Jed alone, but by a coalition of individuals within Wayfair and others who she believes are responsible for damaging her reputation. This pivot is highly revealing because it shows that she is unwilling to let go of the narrative even when the court has signaled that there is not enough evidence to support it against the original person named as the architect of the smear campaign. And rather than accept that there is no proof of this elaborate conspiracy, she is doubling down and claiming that the conspiracy is even larger than before. By targeting independent creators and painting them as the actual smear agents, she is hoping to keep the story alive and justify continued legal action. This is incredibly dangerous because it creates a chilling effect for creators and independent journalists who are simply trying to cover a newsworthy story. Based on publicly available information, her legal team is now sending communications to creators implying or outright stating that we are part of a larger effort to destroy her reputation, that we are being paid by Wayfair or others, that we are acting in bad faith, when the truth is that we are simply reporting on what is happening in courtrooms and in public records. This kind of intimidation tactic is not just about controlling a narrative, it is about silencing dissent and trying to make people afraid to speak out. This is especially alarming because of the kind of media coverage that has followed Blake's allegations since the beginning of this controversy. There has been a pattern of coverage in major outlets that have repeated the same talking points over and over, painting content creators as misogynistic, as alt-right, as anti-Me Too, as conspiracy theorists, as people with an agenda against Blake Lively and her work. Yet none of this is grounded in reality. None of the creators that I know, including myself, have any connection to the groups or ideologies that we are being accused of representing. In fact, most of the people being subpoenaed and harassed by her legal team are women. Most are simply commentators who provide analysis of court proceedings or discuss cultural topics with a focus on accountability and fairness, and yet we are being treated as though we are part of a coordinated attack against her for daring to criticize how she handled the marketing of a film and how she spoke about sensitive issues in the media. We are now being painted as part of a digital conspiracy that includes Wayfair and Baldoni and other unnamed figures, all allegedly working together to manipulate the public against her. And that is where the legal narrative is breaking down. Because if Jed Wallace is no longer part of the case, if he is no longer considered the ringleader of this digital army, then the entire justification for accusing independent creators of being part of his team evaporates. And Blake's legal team knows this. They know they cannot just transfer the blame from one person to an undefined collective and still expect the same legal weight behind their claims. That is why her refusal to file a new complaint is so critical. If she truly believed that she could reassert her claims against Jed or anyone else with proper evidence, she would have done so immediately. Instead, she is attempting to avoid depositions, avoid scrutiny, and shift the blame so that her case can continue without facing the serious deficiencies that the judge already identified. It is also worth noting that in the conversations that are happening in the background among journalists, and legal observers, there is growing concern about the precedent that this sets. I recently spoke with a journalist at Variety, and their reaction was one of genuine surprise that Blake and her husband Ryan Reynolds would take this approach to handling public criticism, especially since it appears to be targeting free speech and independent commentary. The concern is not just about this specific case. It is about what it could mean for the broader media landscape if public figures are able to use their wealth and influence to pursue independent voices with little to no evidence. Then what stops others from doing the same? And more importantly, what kind of message does it send to creators who want to cover controversial stories but are afraid of being dragged into expensive legal battles just for speaking their minds? This goes beyond defamation. This goes beyond reputation management. This is about power. This is about using the legal system as a weapon against criticism, and that is a very dangerous place for us to be as a society, especially when we are constantly being told that the media needs to be protected and that speech must be free. What we are seeing here is the exact opposite of that ideal. We are seeing a public figure with enormous resources trying to reshape the narrative and avoid accountability by blaming everyone else around her for the natural consequences of her own actions, and that is why so many people are starting to push back, because they recognize that this case is not just about Blake Lively. It is about the rights of everyone to speak and report on issues that matter, especially when they are supported by public documents and court evidence. And what we are seeing now is a shift from an already questionable legal case into something much more troubling, and that is a targeted campaign against free expression itself, one that tries to label legitimate criticism as harassment and paint ordinary people as conspirators in a digital war that never existed. And this is where her legal strategy is starting to unravel in a public and undeniable way. As we continue watching this case fall apart in real time, one thing becomes increasingly clear, and that is Blake Lively and her legal team are running out of options, and even faster, they are running out of credibility. What began as a legal effort supposedly designed to protect her image and call out a smear campaign has now spiraled into something that feels more like a desperate attempt to control the narrative at any cost. The fact that she is refusing to sit for depositions while still making sweeping public claims through her attorneys tells us everything we need to know about where this is going. Rather than face legitimate questioning, rather than provide the evidence required to support her accusations, she is choosing to hide behind vague legal threats and increasingly bizarre narratives about who is really behind the so-called attack on her reputation. This latest pivot to blaming content creators, to blaming Wayfair, to blaming Baldoni, to blaming essentially anyone who has ever mentioned her in a critical way tells us that she no longer has confidence in the original story her team sold to the media. This is not just speculation. This is based on the filings themselves. In her amended complaint, she named Jed Wallace as the person who was hired to coordinate and manage a complex social media campaign designed to manipulate public opinion and harm her reputation. She provided supposed pricing for the campaign. She listed specific dates. She even tied actions taken on Reddit, Instagram, and TikTok to a theory that Jed was operating a digital army of influencers and independent journalists to seed content and change the online conversation. And now she is telling us that story is no longer accurate, and that Jed was not in fact the leader of this operation, and that instead somehow all of U.S. content creators, all of us who have been covering the public details of this case, are in fact the ones responsible. That reversal is not just shocking, it is legally problematic, because it shows a total lack of consistency and accountability. In her approach to this litigation, the judge already dismissed Jed Wallace because there was not enough proof that he took any specific action targeting New York, which was the jurisdiction of the case, and without that nexus the court had no standing to hold him accountable in that setting, which is why the judge even suggested a workaround by offering to allow a placeholder complaint that would temporarily bring him back into the fold, just long enough for a deposition. But Blake Lively refused to file that complaint and instead canceled the deposition entirely. If she really believed she had a strong claim against Jed, that was her moment to act. That was her opportunity to put her evidence on the record and proceed with discovery, but she did not do that, and instead she is now claiming that the entire social media response to her film and the way she handled domestic violence themes was not organic, not based on audience reactions, not based on public commentary, but instead coordinated by a mass conspiracy that somehow includes dozens, if not hundreds, of unrelated people who simply shared their opinions online. And this matters not just for the outcome of her case, but for what it says about how public figures engage with criticism in a digital age, because at the core of this entire situation Is a refusal to accept accountability, a refusal to acknowledge that sometimes public backlash is not a conspiracy but a natural response to tone-deaf marketing to failed messaging to avoidable mistakes. It is one thing to be misunderstood by the media. It is another thing to actively rewrite your own legal claims just to fit a new narrative that protects you from scrutiny, and that is what appears to be happening. Here her legal filings no longer match her public statements, and her strategy now seems to rest entirely on intimidating others into silence, including creators like myself, who never received a dollar from anyone and who are only interested in reporting the facts. What is even more troubling is how this tactic seems to be echoed in friendly media coverage in the past few months. We have seen numerous articles published in mainstream outlets that repeat the same story over and over, claiming that independent creators who talk about Blake Lively are part of some alt-right movement or are somehow connected to toxic online spaces that target women. These articles often fail to name specific people. They rarely link to the actual content they reference, and they make sweeping generalizations that lump all criticism into the same box. But the most disturbing part is that nearly all the creators currently facing legal threats from Blake are women. Most are liberal or apolitical, most are not part of any organized ideology, and most are simply covering a case that is both culturally and legally significant. So when these creators are labeled as anti-woman or anti-Me Too, without any real evidence, it raises the question of who is really trying to manipulate the narrative here. Because if you take a step back and look at the broader picture, you begin to see a pattern of powerful people using legal threats to stifle criticism, a pattern of using media connections to shape public perception, and a pattern of doubling down on bad decisions rather than admit fault and change course. And this is why so many in the media world are now starting to express concern, because it sets a precedent that is not just unethical, but deeply damaging to the idea of a free press. If Blake Lively and Reynolds can mobilize an army of attorneys and PR specialists to go after small creators for expressing opinions about a public lawsuit, then what happens the next time a major celebrity wants to bury a scandal? What happens when another famous couple wants to shut down a journalist or a podcast or an independent investigator who is asking difficult questions? This is not just about one case. This is about the growing power imbalance between the elite and the everyday person, between massive legal teams and individuals who cannot afford to fight back, between billion-dollar brands and people with YouTube channels who just want to talk about what is happening in the world around them. And in that context, Blake Lively's actions are not just legally questionable, they are morally indefensible. Instead of owning her role in this public relations disaster, she is trying to weaponize the court system and bully people into silence. And if that tactic works, it will not end with her. It will become the new playbook for every celebrity who finds themselves at the center of public controversy and does not want to deal with the fallout. That is why this story matters. That is why this fight is about more than just one person. And that is why we will not be silenced at this point. It is impossible to ignore that Blake Lively's legal campaign is not just unraveling, but actively exposing a dangerous blueprint for how the powerful can manipulate the justice system to serve public image rather than truth. And what makes this moment so critical is not only the legal outcome itself, but what it symbolizes for every creator, journalist, and citizen who values transparency and freedom of expression. We are no longer watching a case based on strong evidence or legitimate harm. We are watching a case fueled by ego, fear, and control. Blake Lively filed a complaint built around the claim that she was the victim of a smear campaign organized by Jed Wallace, a media strategist, who she claimed mobilized a network of online voices to destroy her reputation. But when Jed was dismissed from the case due to a lack of jurisdiction and insufficient evidence, rather than accept that decision and reevaluate her legal strategy, Blake and her team chose to redirect their accusations toward the very people who had nothing to do with any organized campaign. Independent creators, journalists, legal commentators all became the new focus of her ire. And this pivot is not just unsubstantiated, it is reckless. It is harmful. It is designed to silence criticism, not seek justice. And what we have seen since that moment is an escalation of tactics designed to intimidate rather than inform. Legal threats, vague accusations, the targeting of small creators through costly subpoenas, and public messaging that tries to paint us all as part of some grand conspiracy without a shred of real evidence. It is hard to overstate how destructive this strategy is, because it does not just affect the individuals named in her complaints. It affects the entire culture of online commentary. It affects how people talk about public figures. It affects whether people feel safe expressing critical views about celebrity behavior or decisions in the marketing of their projects. And it creates a chilling precedent that if you say the wrong Think about the wrong person, you might find yourself dragged into a courtroom, accused of participating in a criminal campaign for merely stating your opinion, or reporting on a legal matter. What Blake Lively and her legal team seem unwilling to understand is that public commentary is not a crime, criticism is not harassment, disagreement is not defamation, and if you choose to take on a role as a public advocate, as someone who speaks about serious issues like domestic violence and then tie those issues into your own film and marketing campaigns, then you open yourself up to feedback, both good and bad. And what has happened here is not a smear campaign, it is a backlash, and instead of meeting that backlash with humility or even silence, she has met it with subpoenas and court filings. And behind that legal action is a clear attempt to erase the real reason she is facing criticism. And that reason is that many people felt betrayed by the way she chose to promote a film tied to a serious issue that deserved compassion, not spin. That is not misogyny. That is not conspiracy. That is a natural human response to perceived hypocrisy. And in any other circumstance, that would have been the end of the story. People would have criticized, she could have issued a thoughtful statement or an apology, and the public would have moved on, but instead she chose escalation. And now, as her legal case falls apart and her credibility suffers, she is trying to find a new group to blame, because that is what happens when the truth becomes too inconvenient to face first. It was Jed Wallace, now it is content creators, next it might be journalists, then maybe the platforms themselves, or perhaps some unnamed enemy lurking in the shadows. The strategy is simple: if you cannot prove your case, change the story and keep pointing fingers until people stop asking questions. But what Blake does not seem to realize is that we are not going to stop asking questions, we are not going to be bullied into silence, and we are not going to pretend that this is normal behavior from someone who claims to care about the voices of women and the power of speech. Because what she is doing right now contradicts every value she publicly promotes. She claims to support women, and yet nearly all of the creators being subpoenaed and targeted by her legal team are women. She claims to value journalism and truth, yet she attempts to shut down independent reporting and commentary. She claims to care about democracy, and yet she is taking actions that echo the very tactics we are told to fear from authoritarian figures: the silencing of dissent, the intimidation of critics, the weaponization of legal power against those with far fewer resources. And as creators, as citizens, as people who still believe in the value of truth and speech and fair process, we have a responsibility to call that out. We have a responsibility to say no more. We have a responsibility to stand up, not only for ourselves, but for everyone who might be targeted next by this kind of abuse of power. Because make no mistake, if this strategy succeeds, if Blake Lively is allowed to rewrite her case in real time and drag innocent people into court without consequence, then this will become the new standard for every public figure facing accountability. And the space for honest dialogue will shrink, and that is something none of us should accept. What this case now shows us, beyond any legal technicality or motion to dismiss, is that power used carelessly can destroy people. Not just reputations, not just careers, but real people with real lives and real families who are being forced to spend thousands of dollars to defend their right to speak. What this case shows is that the legal system can be exploited by those with enough money and fear and pride to make their enemies bleed, not with evidence, but with pressure and delay and threats and costs. And if the media does not stand up now, if other creators do not speak out now, if people in the legal world do not raise the alarm now, then this will only grow. This is not about taking sides. This is not about being pro-Blake or anti-Blake. This is about fairness. This is about process. This is about whether the court is a place for justice or just another tool of influence. And at the end of the day, the most frustrating part of all of this is that it did not have to be this way. Blake Lively could have stopped this from becoming a media war. She could have addressed the criticism directly. She could have focused on making things right instead of making things worse. She could have chosen integrity, but instead she chose to fight not for the truth but for control, and in doing so she revealed something about herself, something that cannot be explained away by press releases or lawyer statements or friendly headlines. And that is that when cornered, she would rather burn the village than admit a mistake. She would rather destroy others than accept criticism. She would rather silence everyone than hear a single voice. That does not flatter her, and that is not the mark of strength. That is the mark of fear. That is the mark of someone who cannot accept the consequences of her own decisions. And so, to every creator out there who is watching this unfold, know that you are not alone, you are not crazy, and you are not wrong for speaking the truth. This fight is bigger than any one person, and it will not be won with lawsuits or scare tactics. It will be won with solidarity, with courage, with the refusal to back down. And if nothing else, remember this: the internet does not forget, and neither do we. The truth will out, the smoke will clear, and when it does, the world will see exactly who stood tall and who hid behind power, and when that day comes, we will still be here speaking, writing, filming, documenting, and telling the story. Because that is what we do, and no amount of intimidation will stop us from doing it.